Thank you very much, Frank. It's a real honor to be back here to share with you some of the interesting findings from this book. First, let me explain how I got interested in this particular subject. When I was doing research for my last book, I came across a type of corruption cases that I did not see in the 1980s. These were cases involving multiple individuals.
I'm going to tweet it, Minxin. That's why I'm taking a picture.
Thank you.
So you know I'm trying to get some
right.
bucks.
Thanks. Yeah, and so these at the time that's about 10 years ago. At the time, did not pay much attention to this, but I became aware that this kind of such collusive corruption cases were quite common in the after the 90s. Then for some reason, I got interested in the issue of crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is a very popular term, but as scholars, how can you turn this into an analytical term? How can you analyze crony capitalism? There's some a light bulb goes on in my mind, and maybe crony capitalism, the essence of crony capitalism is collusion. That is, cronies, friends, the derogatory term for friends. So if you find collusive corruption, that could be one way of studying crony capitalism. So this is how I got started. The idea of studying, doing this book came from. So I did some research, and what I found was truly astonishing. That is, I did keyword search of a database that contained publications back to the 80s. And I typed in the Chinese word for collusive corruption. The Chinese government has two technical terms for collusive corruption. One is called 窝案, or a nest of corrupt people. The other is called 串案, a nest of corrupt people. So I typed in these two terms into this large online database called CKNI. And before 1992, there was no single mention. And I also went back and read a lot of corruption cases reported in the media, and I could not find any such case. But after 1992, it became very frequent. So I looked at, the Chinese government incidentally does not give you an aggregate picture of what percentage of corruption cases could be classified as collusive corruption. So I had to cull the data from individual provinces, cities. There's only one national or national survey, national level figure reported by the Chinese National Auditing Agency. So by compiling the data from various provinces, this is the median and average. About 40% to 42% of all corruption cases today are classified as collusive corruption. So that's a really important finding, because collusive corruption is very different from individual corruption, because it involves a lot more people. And the Chinese technical term definition is that within a particular unit, they call unit or jurisdiction, a local government, within a short period of time, they find 3 cases of corruption. It's called a nest of corrupt officials or corrupt individuals, even though this definition does not tell you whether they actually collude with each other. The other definition, called a string of corrupt cases, refers to one particular lead resulting in 3 or more cases. And that clearly indicates direct collusion. When you are confronted with this number as political scientists or researchers, you really want to find out what's behind all this. And there are several prime suspects. The most important one is really a change in institutions, because institutions incentivize behavior. So you want to look for the institutional culprit. So I began to look, and the culprit was very, very clear. This is what hiding in plain sight. That's privatization. That is, incidentally, the Chinese government has never had a formal privatization program. So privatization, strictly speaking, has never occurred in China. They call this property rights reform. So I look at what kind of property rights reform actually had taken place. In the 1980s, there was a lot of ideological opposition to property rights reform. And after 1989, the Tiananmen Square incident, the government, the so-called reformers, gained power or gained ascendance, and then they began to implement gradually, a series of property rights reforms. So I examined the details of China's property rights reform. And these reforms were characterized by one very striking characteristic, one striking combination. On the one hand, property rights have two aspects: control rights and ownership rights. The Chinese government has progressively decentralized control rights, which means more and more people at the lower levels of the Chinese state could determine the disposal of state-owned property. But at the same time, the ownership rights have never been clarified. So if you put the two and two together, you come to this conclusion that it becomes increasingly easy to gain access to or take possession of severely undervalued state assets with no clear ownership. So this is the basic reason that is. But why do they have to engage in collusion? Why can't an individual gain access to this pool of wealth all by himself? The catch is when you have unclear ownership, there are a lot of claimants. A lot of people want to put their hands on the same assets. So most of the people who try to gain assets are not government officials. For reasons I will explain later, government officials are not in the very good position to take possession of state-owned assets. The people who really want to gain access to the undervalued assets are private entrepreneurs, because they know the value of assets. They have the risk capital to use to bribe or to pay down, because you really have to pay something for those undervalued assets. And they have the entrepreneurial skills to realize the potential value of those assets. But for private entrepreneurs who want to gain access to those assets, their problem is that those assets are controlled by different government agencies. And if they do not go through all the government agencies, they cannot gain control, because there are so many veto points in this process. So they have to bribe not just one person, but a series of officials. And they've come up with a set of very clever methods. I'll describe them later on, how they do this. So this is the primary driver. There are other drivers, of course. In addition to, because the reality is always more complex than theory. In building theoretical framework, you want to identify one cause. In this story, there were secondary causes as well. Another primary suspect is China's economic development strategy. In the 1980s, China's economic development was far more balanced than it is today. Since the early 1990s, the Chinese government began to shift away from a balanced strategy to an investment-driven growth strategy. And in the investment part of this story, there is a huge piece, and that's infrastructure. Infrastructure investment in China averages about 10-11% of GDP. That's about 3 times what the U.S. spends, more than 3 times the U.S. spends on infrastructure. So that's a huge piece. But when you look at the underlying dynamics of the approval process of infrastructure, they are almost the same as the approval process for privatizing or implementing property rights reform of state-owned assets. Incidentally, state-owned assets are mostly land, mines, and state-owned enterprise assets. So if in the infrastructure story, you also have the same. If a private entrepreneur or contractor who wants to build this highway, he also has to bribe a string of officials. So that's, then finally, I look at what I call an enabling factor. That is, how do you explain the rise of a separate phenomenon? That is, in China today, you often hear the term 买官, that is public office for sale. And again, I typed in keyword, this practice did not exist in the 1980s, but since the 1990s became prevalent. How to explain this? Is there any connection between crony capitalism on the one hand and the corruption in personnel management inside the Chinese Communist Party? So I again looked at, searched for a major institutional reform, and I found one. That is, since 1984, the Chinese government began to radically decentralize the control of appointments of local officials. Before 1984, the government, the personnel management system was such that a provincial official, a provincial level government cannot appoint any officials it immediately supervises. It can only appoint officials so-called 2 levels down. So for example, this is the provincial, this is city, and then this is the county. The provincial official, the provincial party secretary can only appoint the county level official. And I will explain why this actually changed the dynamics within the Chinese state. Because before that, there was no market for public office. You simply, the buyers and the sellers are insulated from each other. After that reform was announced, and it took about 5 years for them actually to figure out how to do it. So the system was fully in place only in the early 1990s. After that system became fully functional, then a market for public office was created, because the supervisor and the supervisee are in daily contact. They can actually conduct transactions. And it is this market that enabled, in one particular kind of collusion, private entrepreneurs to have a much easier access to state-owned property. And I'll explain this later on. So this is basically the theoretical framework, that you look at changes in property rights, you look at changes in China's development strategy, and you look at changes in the personnel management system, and the pieces seem to fall together. Incidentally, when you look at the most corrupt areas in China, they all involve state-owned assets. Land, real estate, mining, state-owned enterprises. So just on the face of it, it seems that the story makes intuitive sense. So how do I go about conducting research? Because corruption is very difficult to study. Dangerous too, in the case. And in one of the categories I study is corruption involving mafia, organized crime in China, and local police. So you clearly, I think, my insurance company would not condone any such activity. Yeah. So there are 2 ways you study corruption. Ideally, you want to have a large random sample, but it's impossible to get. And even if you have large data, aggregate data, they don't tell you much in terms of details. Or you can look at one or two single case studies. At depth, you have a lot of interesting details, but how representative are they? Can you extract some illuminating data? So my approach is something in the middle. I only look for collusive corruption cases because I find reference to a corruption case and I look at how many people were involved. If more than 3 people were involved, then they go into my database. So I managed to find 260. And the beauty, not the beauty, the I would call it beauty because if you read it, it's really a very good read. The attractiveness of this approach is that you can gain, it's because it's large enough, you can gain some quantitative data out of, extract some quantitative data out of this. Of course, you're aware that these are not random, but at the same time, you're going to also extract a lot of behavioral characteristics and patterns and details from the cases. So you probably can get the best of both worlds. So I got 260 cases, 50 of them concern the market for public office. The other 50 were cases involving private businessmen and government officials, and 50 cases were collusive corruption in state-owned enterprises. 50 cases were organized crime and law enforcement, and 30 cases were courts. 20 cases were regulatory agencies, mostly environmental protection and work safety inspection agencies. Now is that. So how do they collude? This is the if you want to collude, collusion has enormous benefits to those who participate in collusion. That's why I think collusion is now one of the most commonly observed form of collusion. Aside from the institutional changes that encourage collusion, there is an endogenous factor that encourages collusion. I call this collusion begets collusion for the following reasons. That is, the more people who engage in collusion, the more other people will engage in collusion as well. The first one, as I will show later in my quantitative analysis, is that those who engage in collusion tend to reduce the risks of detection. That is, they can remain corrupt for a longer period of time than those who do not. The reason is very simple. They protect each other. The second reason for collusion is that if you engage in collusion, you're more likely to succeed in looting or stealing bigger projects, larger sums of money, because such theft is much more complex, much more sophisticated. A single person alone cannot do it. So corruption income is going to be much higher for those who engage in collusion. And the third dynamic is the well-known dynamic of bad money driving out good money. So for people who engage in collusion, those who are clean become threats to them. So they are going to do anything possible, try to exclude them, make life miserable for them, or marginalize them. So over time, in a jurisdiction or government agency with where collusion is going on, where there are multiple networks of collusive corruption going on, the entire government agency could be colonized by collusive officials. So that's why I think collusion has become such a widespread phenomenon. So how do they actually engage in collusion? That is, there's basically three models of collusion. One is what I call vertical collusion. Private entrepreneurs are very clever. When they bribe somebody, they pay not only for a piece of asset or a business deal or contract, they actually factor in something called transaction costs. Because the difficulty for a private entrepreneur is that he will have to play the role of coordinator in chief, because he will have to go through various government agencies to line up support, colluders. And it's very time consuming. And but what if he can get somebody who can do the job for him? And that's where the party secretary comes in, because the Chinese party secretary controls personnel employment after 1984, after the implementation of 1984 reform. So if the party secretary has taken bribes from officials in these key positions, and typically, as I will explain later on, officials only pay bribes to get appointed to those key positions, where they can get bribes from other people. He can actually have a network of willing accomplices to help him help out the private entrepreneur. So the private, or even if he does not have willing accomplices, he can use his enormous personnel authority to force other people to do his bidding on behalf of the private entrepreneur. So in this case, the private entrepreneur simply pays the party secretary what I call a premium bribes that cover both the expected return, of course, a share of the return of the deal, plus transaction costs. So when you look at the amount of bribes collected by party secretaries, typically they are much larger than bribes collected by other people, because transaction costs have been factored in. So when I look at the officials, my 50 cases of officials colluding with private businessmen, and I read this sentencing documents, I read the description of their sentences. Sometimes you cannot gain sentences, the sentencing documents online. There were references to their engagement in so-called buying and selling office. So 68% of them engaged in of the officials who were exposed as colluding with private businessmen. 68% of them were engaged in selling office for private gains. So that supports the hypothesis that vertical collusion relies mainly on the mechanism on this practice, because this is the practice that has helped local party officials form their network. But the problem is that if you can gain access to the party secretary, that's perfect, because you can ensure that he would deliver. But the problem with this tactic is that party secretaries are very picky. They don't want to take on anybody. You just cannot walk into the door of a party secretary and say, would you like to take $1 million and be my, then do A, B, C, D? Because the party secretary is not a dumb guy. He only picks customers that are well established. So typically he would serve local tycoons, the big guys. And those who do not have direct access to him will have to be very creative. And in my database, there is this really interesting story. So there's this real estate developer who wanted that piece of land, but he did not know the party secretary. But he did find out about the party secretary's mistress. So one day he showed up with $500,000 in front of the mistress's apartment. And the mistress, of course, took $500,000 and then eventually got to see the party secretary. So what if you do not know the party secretary? You cannot gain access to him because he's a picky customer. Then you move on to the second model of collusion, what I call this outsider-insider collusion. so this involves typically a less well-established second-tier entrepreneur, denied access to party secretary. He would go around individual government agencies to bribe a string of officials to get the necessary approval for mines, for land, for projects, and so on and so forth. But this is very time-consuming, and transaction costs are high. So when you look at the amount of bribes these officials get, they tend to be a lot less because there's a discount for transaction costs. And the third kind of collusion is what I call horizontal collusion among insiders. These are typical cases involving state-owned enterprise executives, policemen, regulatory officials in government agencies or courts, because among these officials typically have equal status of power. They all control different parts of a process, so they really have to collude with each other to do engage in insider theft. So these are the three models, and in this 260 cases, you can see all of them well represented. Now let me share with you some of the very interesting market dynamics. That is how the corruption market functions. We have a lot of assumptions, but we don't have a lot of data or examples to back them up. One interesting characteristic of this market is that sometimes you know that there are overlapping networks of corruption in a given local government. They are not connected with each other. They all know about each other, but they do not rat on each other. So you want, even though the patrons of competing networks are political adversaries of each other. In the sample, I saw at least two cases that the party secretary and the mayor were deadly enemies. They could not wait to see the other in jail. They all knew about each other's crime, but they did not denounce each other. So you wonder what is going on. Actually, it's very. But as soon as the other one, as soon as the mayor or the party secretary is in jail, he ratted on the mayor or the party secretary. So that actually explains a lot, and it explains something called mutual assured destruction at work, because they all have dirt on each other, and it makes no sense to act preemptively because the other is going, the target will bring you down as well. So they all protect each other. That's why collusive corruption has this huge externality. That is, very corrupt places remain very corrupt for a very long time.
Diego Gambetta just wrote a paper for the World Bank about this happening in Italy, basically mutually holding hostages.
Mutually hostage. Yes.
Yeah.
Also, that is how do they show that we are dirty? That's another practice, which is, I think, the age of Trump. We can talk about this. When officials
But
die,
not in a partisan way.
Not in a partisan way. No. Very respectful of women. In fact, they would take their mistresses to dinners, to banquets. They all show up with mistresses because this is another way to show that you have nothing to fear from me. So if you don't have mistresses to take with you, don't show up at those banquets. So that's another mutual hostage taking. So in other words, there are codes that can communicate quite effectively in this. Now, other aspects of this corruption market is that how large should a network be? Because if you engage in collusion, you need to strike a balance between having enough people who can help you get the job done, but not having too many people that can dilute income. The optimal size for insider collusion is about 7 people. If you think about it, it's 7 people not too large, not too small. Judges about 6, law enforcement officers about 6, and SOE executive about 7. So inside. What about officials and businessmen? The median size about 11. It makes sense because I think 11 does not. The number here, because the Chinese government does not really break down how many of them are officials, how many of them are businessmen. It seems that it's a mix. So it makes sense for the party official to take on a small number of businessmen, but also other officials will be involved. And then the profitability, that is, whether, because the assumption of this project is that it's the availability of undervalued nominally state-owned assets that is creating the incentives. So maybe it's reflected in bribery, in the amount of bribery. Yes, that is, you look at sort of the amount of bribes they collect. For county officials who engage in mostly corruption with private businessmen, their median corruption income is 2.4 million yuan, which is roughly about 650,000. But remember, you have to, if you want to convert that into dollars, remember Chinese per capita income is 1/5 the US. For officials who collude with businessmen, median income. Sorry, this is the 2.4 is about buying and selling office. For officials in the 50 case sample colluding with businessmen, their median corruption income is 9.5 million, because most of them involved in handing out state-owned assets. For SOE officials, they also could dispose state-owned assets. It's 6.4 million yuan. Law enforcement officers, they sell only services, protection services, and the judges, they sell services as well. So and regulatory agency officials, they sell services as well. Their corruption income is about 1/10 of those that I've listed. Law enforcement officials, they collude with organized crime, very risky activity. Their median corruption income is 660,000 yuan. Judges, 760,000 yuan. And regulatory agency officials, 500,000 yuan. So you can see a huge discount applied to services, because private businessmen are not dumb. They are not going to overpay. Let me just add one more thing. That is, in thinking about crony capitalism, one big question at the back of our mind is, who actually benefits more from crony capitalism? The capitalists or corrupt officials? By far capitalists. Of course, I admit I do not have data for very senior Chinese leaders. And I think at that level, senior leaders, because they have a lot, they can dispose gigantic state-owned assets. But most of the people in my sample are provincial level, city level, and county level. Even I could not tell the amount of profit extracted from undervalued assets by private businessmen, but based on the description of the assets, land, and the amount of bribes they collected for individual act of corruption, I thought it's no more than 10-20% of the realized value profit. And the third question is that, is there a correlation between power and corruption income? Because we all think that the more powerful you are, the higher corruption income you can generate. Yes, that is because I have 3 levels of officials: county, city, and province. I only mentioned the median because there's huge variations. I use the median. The median corruption income for a county official, county party secretary, is per year, average about 370,000 yuan per year. His immediate boss is a city party boss, is 600,000, so almost 80% more. and then the provincial level official is 800,000 per year. So you can see the difference. And then because initially I talked about low detection rates, do officials engage in collusive corruption actually enjoy low detection risks? Yes, this is I look at one subset, that is these are county level, prefecture level, and provincial level. The average, the median duration of crime. The Chinese news reports and Chinese court documents are very helpful. They always give you the start date of their crime and then end with the date of their arrest. So you can actually calculate. So for county level official, it's 6.5 years. Prefecture level official is 8.3 years, and provincial level 10.6 years. So it's pretty long. So, but even more astonishing is whether that is this figure. 84% of them were promoted while they were engaging in corrupt activities. Because you look at their CV, their resume, or a brief description of their resume, you can tell whether they've been promoted. Some of them multiple times, because a promotion requires vetting. So if the vetting process cannot uncover their criminal activities, then the vetting process clearly is not functioning very well. So it shows, then the last one is that because I don't have a lot of time left, let me just show you just how well the market functions. I'm not going to say that the market is efficient. The market the market is well developed. The case that I used a subset of cases is 50 cases of 买官, that is buying and selling office. Chinese news media is full of horror stories about government officials bidding on offices, party secretaries advertising prices. Actually, this doesn't happen, especially advertising. I have not seen a single case of a party secretary having a list of offices for sale. So the first problem you have is that whether how can a buyer know how much to pay? How can the buyer discover price? What's the price point? So by reading all 50 cases, I found there are actually two different markets at work. One market is you might call relationship leveraged market. That is, the person who wants this particular office, he would approach the party secretary. He does not want to pay too much. So he takes a very low risk financially and also politically strategy. He would make installment payments to discover the price point. Typically, the first installment, I call it down payment, takes place when the parties, when it is Chinese New Year, it is the Moon Festival, when they exchange gifts. So they would give the party secretary a box of mooncake and said, look at the bottom. Cakes, so they will put cash beneath, and if the party secretary is hospitalized, then it's even better. This is for some ginseng money, right? So they would give some money. If the party secretary takes the bait, then this means you are in luck. Because you are not going to name the position, just say, I hope you will support my work in the future. The deal is struck the second time. So the second payment is made between the two when the buyer actually identifies the office. And then the third payment, I call the closing payment, is that the party secretary delivers the position and then goes to the party secretary's house, thank you so much, that's it, closing payment. I'm not seeing, maybe they will continue to give small gifts, but I'm not seeing major bribes given to the party secretary once the transaction is done. So this is a very sophisticated installment payment plan. The discount is given because of personal relationship. But there's another segment. I call this blind bidding. What if the guy does not own party secretaries? He still wants their job. So it happens only in a small number of cases. The guy will show up, dump a sack of money on the party secretary's table and say, I want that position, please help me. Typically they overpay because they cannot humiliate, insult the party secretary by giving something very, very small. Interestingly, it also shows that the market at the county level is much more developed at the city level. City is a much bigger jurisdiction, 5-6 million people. Because city party secretaries can allocate party secretary positions in counties, magistrates in counties. These positions are located because in each jurisdiction they can have a rich county, poor county, so much more heterogeneous goods. But in counties, the positions are sold much more homogeneous. So the prices paid actually reflect. So I got two subsets of county level prices and city level prices. County level prices, one mark of what I call standardized pricing is that there's not much standard deviation between the median price and the standard deviation. So in a county, it's one standard deviation. In cities, it's two standard deviations. So the median price. So in other words, the price varies a great deal the bigger the jurisdiction, which means it's much harder to find a market clearing price. So people overpay a lot. Now, when you say they overpay, you have to take this into perspective, because the median price paid for a bureau chief of a county is the size of a congressional district, 500,000 people. Very lucrative. It's 20,000 yuan, $3,000. It's nothing. But so then you ask why there's such a steep discount. Does this mean the market is not functioning? Actually, it's not. Actually, it means the market functions as intended, because the party secretary gets rotated once every 3 years. So essentially, he has the problem a fruit seller has, right? The shelf life is not very long. He has perishable goods he has to dispose. That's why he applies this discount. But even more important is that the real purpose of selling an office to somebody is not to get his or her bribery income, but to recruit that person into this network of collusive corruption, because most of the corruption income of a party secretary comes from private businessmen. When I look at the subset of officials whose main crime, according to the official press, was buying and selling office, actually 80% of them simultaneously engage in taking bribes from private businessmen. That's a much more lucrative activity. That's why the such a steep discount. Now, what about does the price paid reflect the value of the office? In other words, government agencies are not equally profitable as sources of corruption income generators. Actually, the market knows it very well. So you, in several cases, you actually have a list of bribes paid for certain offices. Invariably, somebody who controls Land Bureau, Finance Bureau, Education Bureau, because Education Bureau chiefs can decide on building classrooms. That's why classrooms in China tend not to be very safe, and buying textbooks. So they tend to get prices bid for these offices are very high. Then at the lower end, my favorite example was the vaccination station, deputy director vaccination station. So sold for 5,000 yuan. That's like less than 1,000 US dollars. So the market, then another question you ask is, do party chiefs actually honor their deals? The good news is that they do. I got honor among thieves. The party secretaries always deliver. So you ask why that is the case. It's actually it's a small market, it's a niche market. The word gets out very quickly. If the party secretary keeps cheating on his customers, he's done. He will have a very bad reputation. And when, because there's bidding, right? In these two cases, different people bid on the same office. And the highest bidder won. So what happened to the other people who put down the down payment? The party secretary refunded their down payment minus expenses, because there's something like 20% less than the equity. So it's I think when I go through these things, you would say that this is a market that's deeply entrenched. This is a post-Tiananmen order, actually. What I've described is that this did not take place overnight. It's over the last 25 years after Tiananmen, or 27 years after Tiananmen, did this market gradually evolve into this very sophisticated market. Now, let me just conclude by commenting on two things. One is, why do I title the book as Dynamics of Regime Decay? Because in the China field, there's a very lively debate on whether the regime is resilient or fragile, is it decaying? Based on my book, I think it is decaying because of three sets of dynamics. One is that clearly this is a prime example of privatization of state power. These agents of the state are privatizing or have privatized the power of the state in the pursuit of their individual or small group interests. The second dynamic is that we see the formation of patronage networks spread throughout state agencies. And because of the Chinese government's control of the information on corruption inside the military, I cannot include the military. But military is another institution in which in which buying and selling commissions is rampant. The top two Chinese generals have been sentenced to life in prison. Well, one died before he could go to jail because they sold offices to other Chinese generals. Something like 70 Chinese generals have been arrested in the last 3.5 years. Of course, there can be politically motivated arrests. But you see this, the emergence or the formation of what I call mini patrimonialism inside the Chinese state. And the last dynamic is something I've already mentioned, bad money driving out good money. That is, over time, the Chinese party state is colonized by such individuals. So the second comment is on whether Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive is going to make a fundamental difference, because he has launched the most sustained, ferocious, and I would say for the short term effective anti-corruption drive we've seen in post-49 history. I don't think so, because he's not dealing with the fundamental conditions. State ownership of assets, lack of transparency, lack of freedom of the press. What he has done is what I call, he has suspended the trading in the market. He has not destroyed the market. So as soon as the suspension is lifted, trade will resume in this market. Thank you.